Hi everyone, so today I'll be doing an ISO comparison test between my Olympus E-M5 Mark III with the 14-140 kit lens and against the Canon EOS RP with its respective 24-240 kit lens. And the reason I chose these two cameras is because they're very comparably priced right now in the US market. You can buy either of these cameras right now, like at Best Buy, for $14.99 with the lenses. So it's really a amazing deal for a full frame camera, right? Because a lot of my viewers have been asking me what I thought about the Canon RP, and I said, I don't know. So I went and I borrowed one from my cousin, and I'm going to run a series of tests. You may have already seen the one I just finished on the 1080p video and autofocus and color and all that. Today we'll be doing ISO. So basically what I did is I put the Canon aperture priority, then I set the ISO to 100, 200, 400, 800, etc. And then I put the Olympus into full manual mode, and then I matched the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO exactly to what the Canon shot at. Now, I noticed in the images that the Olympuses were maybe a quarter of a stop, not quite a third, darker than the Canons. And honestly, what I should have done is, let the shutter speed open up a little bit longer to make up for that difference in light. I think it might be due to the lens t-stops might be a little bit different, but I think in the end, it really doesn't make that much difference. The full frame is going to win an ISO test every time, right? So I just said, it's fine. We'll just let it go at that, but I just wanted to make that note for you. Also, I'll be doing a dynamic range test. Because people have said that the sensor in this particular Canon doesn't have the greatest dynamic range, and I think you might be surprised though. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a little 3-minute montage of the ISO comparisons, and then we'll come back and talk about the dynamic range. Now the E-M5 Mark III doesn't have an ISO 100, so I just put it into ISO 64 and matched it to the Canon ISO 100, which is the Canon's base ISO. Here's a full shot with the Olympus on the left and the Canon on the right. And you'll notice the Canon colors. I did match the white balance to the scene for each camera individually. And yet the Canon, reds and oranges are much stronger and brighter than compared to the Olympus. So they're a little bit more, I'd say, not as realistic as colors as we get from the Olympus camera. But a lot of people kind of like that look, a little bit warmer tones to their images. I think even at ISO 800, both cameras are holding up pretty well. I wouldn't complain about any of these. And this scene here, is just the depth of field difference. It's nothing wrong with the lens on the Canon. It just has a shallower depth of field being a full frame camera. So if the images look blurrier on one than the other, that's all it is. Like here, if you look at the lettering on the lens, the Canon is blurrier, but that's purely because of depth of field. And I think we're still holding up pretty well at 3200, but it's very subjective at this point, right? A little color noise reduction in Lightroom or whatever, and these images will still be pretty close. Now I think at ISO 6400, it's going to be a little harder to clean up the Micro Four Thirds, the M5. We could still get pretty close though. I think, for Instagram, Facebook, anything you put online, social media, a little bit of cleanup and post-processing, even if you do it to both of the images from the Canon and the EM5, you would have a hard time telling the difference on an Instagram image. And then up here at 25,000, you know, the EM5 is definitely gone, and the Canon, you still could probably recover that, but they're both pretty much out of acceptable range for any professional work. All right, now let's look at dynamic range or ISO invariance, whatever you want to call it. Basically what I've done here is I overexposed the scene by 3 stops, and I shot these at each camera's base ISO of 200 on the EM5 and 100 on the Canon RP. And that's because, you know, the manufacturer tells us this is where we get the best image quality, the most dynamic range, etc. Now, all we need to do here is bring the exposure back down by 3 stops. So I'll just type in -3. And let's slide the highlight slider all the way down. And then we'll do the same thing on the Canon, -3, and then we'll pull the highlights all the way back down here. All right, good. Now let's compare these two. And we'll go right over here to the Mark V. And you can see that the EM5 Mark III actually did a better job at saving the highlights on this image. You can see plenty of shadow detail along this fender, all the way down in here. And then if we go over to the windshield, you can see that there's still a lot more detail behind the windshield. This is all blown out here on the Canon. Look at the fender here, it's totally gone. Whereas on the EM5, it's perfectly fine. And then over here, look at this door. We can see all of the detail, the seams and the you know, shading and everything here, whereas over here it's all completely clipped. Like you can't even tell there's any, you know, texture or anything here, whereas on the EM5 you can still see where the fender comes over the little M and everything. So definitely the EM5 Mark III beat the Canon here in terms of recovering highlights, which is really good for landscapes where you have very bright clouds and things like that. So that surprised me a little, that the EM5 Mark III could beat a full frame camera in highlights. But again, you know, people say that this particular sensor in the Canon doesn't have the greatest dynamic range, and that seems to bear out here. Now let's do the same thing on the shadows. So here I've underexposed each shot by 3 stops, and I'm at a base ISO. And all I did was basically adjust the shutter speed to match the exposure. But let's go ahead and add 3 stops in Lightroom and push the shadows. Do the same thing on the Canon. Push the shadows all the way up. And let's compare. We'll go right over here to my favorite Pentax camera. And wow, look at that. Even in the shadow area, the EM5 did a better job than the Canon in recovering the shadows. I thought that was really interesting. Let's look under the car. Yeah. The Canon has tons of color noise in here versus the EM5 Mark III. So I think in terms of dynamic range, the EM5 Mark III has a little bit of an advantage here. Maybe a stop, I wouldn't say quite 2 stops, but at least a stop difference on either end in dynamic range, right? Now, let's look at a high ISO shot, because this might surprise you. All right, now here I've properly exposed the image, but I shot at ISO 1600 instead of base ISO. And I was curious to see how much of the shadows and highlights we could recover on a high ISO image. So let's do the same thing. But instead of adjusting exposure, we're just going to push the shadows all the way. And then we're going to push the shadows all the way on the Canon. And let's go back and take a quick look at the shadow area here. And now the Canon is doing a better job by roughly half a stop to a stop, I'd say. Because look at the shadow area here under the lens. Lots of color noise, but under the Canon, not as much. I mean, there's still some, all the way around here. Let's look under the car. So it's kind of reversed, right? I'd say about a half a stop to a stop here difference. Getting less noise when you're trying to push the shadows on the Canon. So I did not expect that based on the base ISO test that I did. Now let's look at the highlights. So let's pull the highlights all the way down. Do the same thing on the Canon. But I'd say it's a pretty even here. The Canon is a little bit brighter, the exposure, but I'd say highlight wise, we didn't lose anything. We still saved all of the highlights. I'd call it a draw here, but definitely on the shadow side, we definitely, the Canon definitely wins. And on the highlight side, I'd call it a draw at this point. Now let's try this at ISO 6400. No surprise, the Canon is still doing a better job at ISO 6400, just like it did at ISO 1600. Let's go over to the highlights. And same story. I would call this a draw in terms of saving the highlights. Nothing bad here. But the noise, definitely the Canon is doing a better job. All right, so there are the side-by-side comparisons of the ISOs between the two cameras, and no surprise, the Canon full frame did a better job in the higher ISOs. What was a little surprising though is that at base ISO, when we over and underexpose a shot, that the Olympus was able to recover highlights and shadows much cleaner. I mean, the Canon lost the highlights totally, and then in the shadow area it was much noisier, I think, by at least a stop. And it was only really when we got into the higher ISOs where I tested at ISO 6400 and ISO 1600 that we saw the Canon kind of reclaim its throne, right? And recover the shadows with a little less noise, and then the highlights were about the same. It didn't really do any better or worse than I think the Olympus. But those are my tests. I hope you enjoyed that. Stay tuned. I'm going to be doing more tests. If you'd like me to try something specific, just leave it in the comments below. But either way, hopefully we'll see you again soon.